The cold wind bit through the thin fabric of his jacket as the boy huddled in the shadow of the alley, his breath visible in the frosty air. His name was Leo, though no one had called him by it in months. The streets had become his home, his family, his world. He was just another face in the crowd, invisible to the bustling city that moved around him like a river around a stone. But today, Leo's life was about to collide with something that would change everything. It started with a shout, a desperate, raw cry that cut through the noise of the city like a knife. "Don't eat that." His voice was hoarse, but it carried an urgency that made heads turn. A man in a sleek, tailored coat paused mid-step, his hand frozen in the air, a half-eaten pastry inches from his lips. He wasn't just any man. He was Alexander Kane, one of the wealthiest men in the city, a billionaire who had built an empire from nothing. His sharp eyes narrowed as they landed on the scruffy boy who had just interrupted his morning routine. Leo's heart pounded as he stepped forward, his bare feet crunching on the icy pavement. He knew he was taking a risk. People like Alexander Kane didn't stop for people like him. But this was different. This wasn't about him. That's poisoned, Leo stammered, his voice trembling but firm. Alexander's expression shifted from annoyance to something unreadable. He lowered the pastry, his gaze never leaving the boy. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with something dangerous. Leo swallowed hard, his mind racing. He didn't have time to think, to plan. He just knew he had to stop him. "I saw someone put something in it. Back there, by the bakery. I tried to warn you, but you were too far away. I had to shout." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and charged. Alexander's eyes flicked to the pastry, then back to Leo. For a moment, neither of them moved. The city seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, Alexander dropped the pastry into a nearby trash can. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes was enough to make Leo's stomach twist. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Alexander turned to leave, Leo felt a surge of panic. He didn't know why he'd done it, why he'd risked everything to warn this stranger. But something in Alexander's face, in the way he carried himself, had struck a chord deep within him. It was a feeling he couldn't explain, a connection he didn't understand. And now, as the billionaire disappeared into the crowd, Leo was left standing alone in the cold, wondering what he'd just set in motion. The story of Leo and Alexander Kane was just beginning. A homeless boy, with nothing to lose, and a billionaire with everything to gain. Two worlds colliding in a way that would change both of their lives forever. But as the first chapter of their story unfolded, one question lingered in the air, unanswered and heavy with possibility. Why had Leo risked everything to save a man he didn't even know? And what would happen when Alexander Kane found out the truth? The tension was palpable, the stakes higher than either of them could have imagined. And as the city buzzed around them, oblivious to the drama unfolding in its midst, Leo and Alexander were left standing on the edge of something neither of them could have predicted. Something dangerous. Something life-changing. Something that would force them to confront the darkest corners of their pasts and the uncertain future that lay ahead. But for now, the story pauses here, on the brink of revelation, with the echoes of Leo's warning still hanging in the air. What happens next? That's a story for another time. But one thing is certain. Nothing will ever be the same. The moment Alexander Kane disappeared into the crowd, Leo felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because the billionaire had listened to him, at least enough to discard the pastry. Dread because he knew this wasn't the end. People like Alexander didn't just walk away from something like this. They asked questions. They dug deeper. And when they did, Leo wasn't sure he was ready for what would come next. Leo slipped back into the shadows of the alley, his mind racing. He hadn't planned any of this. He hadn't even meant to be near the bakery that morning. But fate, or something like it, had pulled him there. He'd seen the man in the black hoodie slip something into the pastry display when the baker wasn't looking. He'd seen the way the man's eyes darted around, nervous and calculating. And then he'd seen Alexander Kane, the man whose face was plastered on billboards and magazine covers, walk up to the display and pick up the very pastry that had been tampered with. Leo hadn't thought. He just acted. Now, as he crouched behind a dumpster, trying to steady his breathing, He wondered if he'd made a mistake. Maybe he should have stayed quiet. Maybe he should have let things play out the way they were meant to. But something inside him, something he couldn't quite name, had pushed him to speak up. It was the same feeling that had kept him alive on the streets all these years, a gut instinct, a survival mechanism, and it had never steered him wrong before. Across town, Alexander Kane sat in the back of his chauffeured car, his mind replaying the encounter with the boy. There was something about him, something in his eyes, in the way he'd spoken, that had struck a chord. Alexander wasn't a man who believed in coincidences. He'd built his empire by trusting his instincts, by seeing opportunities where others saw only obstacles. And right now, his instincts were telling him that the boy was more than just a random street kid. "Pull over," Alexander said suddenly, his voice sharp. The driver obeyed without question, pulling the car to the curb. Alexander stepped out, his coat billowing in the wind, and walked back toward the bakery. He needed answers. He needed to know who had tried to poison him and why. The bakery was quiet when he entered, the smell of fresh bread and pastries filling the air. The baker, a middle-aged man with flour dusted on his apron, looked up in surprise. "Mr. Kane," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "What can I do for you?" Alexander didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The pastry I picked up earlier," he said, his tone clipped. "Who else handled it?" The baker frowned, confused. "No one, sir. I made them myself this morning. They've been in the display case all day." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Think carefully. Was there anyone near the display? Anyone who might have tampered with it?" The baker's eyes widened as the implication sank in. I don't know," he stammered. "I was in the back for a few minutes. There could have been someone." Alexander didn't wait for him to finish. He turned on his heel and walked out, his mind racing. If the boy was telling the truth, and Alexander's gut told him he was and someone had tried to kill him, but who? And why? Meanwhile, Leo was on the move. He knew he couldn't stay in one place for too long. The streets had taught him that much. But as he wandered through the city, his thoughts kept circling back to Alexander Kane. He didn't know much about the man, but he'd heard the stories. The self-made billionaire, the ruthless businessman, the philanthropist who donated millions to charity, but was rumoured to have a dark side. Leo didn't know what to believe. All he knew was that Alexander was dangerous, and now, so was he. As the day wore on, Leo found himself drawn to the part of the city where the wealthy lived. He didn't know why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper. But as he stood outside the towering gates of Alexander's mansion, he felt a chill run down his spine. This was a world he didn't belong to, a world that had no place for someone like him. And yet, here he was. Inside the mansion, Alexander was pacing his study, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He'd already put his security team on high alert, but he knew that wouldn't be enough. He needed to find the boy. He needed to know what he knew, and he needed to do it fast. The sound of the doorbell startled him out of his thoughts. He frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He walked to the door and opened it, his eyes narrowing as he saw who was standing there. It was Leo. The boy looked even smaller, up close, his face pale and drawn, his clothes hanging off his thin frame. But there was a fire in his eyes, a determination that made Alexander pause. "I need to talk to you," Leo said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Alexander studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." As Leo stepped into the mansion, he felt like he was stepping into another world. The opulence, the grandeur, it was overwhelming. But he didn't have time to be intimidated. He had to tell Alexander what he knew. He had to warn him. "It wasn't just about you," Leo said as soon as the door closed behind them. "The man in the hoodie. He wasn't acting alone. There's something bigger going on. Something dangerous." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Leo took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I overheard them talking. They mentioned a name. Someone powerful. Someone who wants you out of the way." Alexander's expression darkened. "Who?" Leo hesitated. He didn't know if he could trust Alexander, but he didn't have a choice. They called him the broker. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Alexander's mind raced. The broker. He'd heard the name before, whispered in the shadows of the business world. A faceless, nameless figure who pulled the strings behind the scenes. If the broker was involved, then this was bigger than he'd thought. Much bigger. "Why are you telling me this?" Alexander asked, his voice low. Leo met his gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Because I don't want to see anyone else get hurt. And because I think you're the only one who can stop him." The tension in the room was palpable, the stakes higher than ever. Alexander knew he was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could change everything. And as he looked at Leo, he realized that the boy was more than just a street kid. He was a key to unraveling the mystery, to stopping the broker, to saving himself. But time was running out. The broker's network was vast, his reach limitless. And if Alexander and Leo were going to stop him, they would have to move fast. The story was far from over. The conflict was deepening, the stakes rising with every passing moment. And as the two unlikely allies stood face to face, the tension between them was a living, breathing thing. What would happen next? Would they be able to uncover the truth in time? Or would the broker's web of deceit and danger prove too much for them to handle? The answers were just out of reach, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. But one thing was certain. The climax was coming, and it would change everything. Alexander Kane's study was silent, except for the faint ticking of an antique clock on the wall. The weight of Leo's words hung heavy in the air. The broker, a name that sent a chill down Alexander's spine. He had heard whispers of this shadowy figure, a puppet master who manipulated fortunes and lives from behind the scenes. But he had never imagined that he himself would become a target. Leo shifted uncomfortably on the plush chair, his threadbare sneakers sinking into the thick carpet. He felt out of place in this world of wealth and power, but he knew he couldn't back down now. "I don't know much," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I heard them talking about a meeting. Tonight. At the old docks. They said it's where the broker's plans are set in motion." Alexander's mind raced. The docks were a labyrinth of abandoned warehouses, and crumbling piers a perfect place for something illicit to go down. If Leo was telling the truth, this could be his only chance to confront the broker and end this before it escalated. But it was a risk. A huge risk. "Why should I trust you?" Alexander asked, his voice sharp. He wasn't used to relying on anyone, let alone a homeless kid who had appeared out of nowhere. Leo met his gaze, his eyes steady despite the fear in them. "You don't have to trust me," he said. "But if I'm lying, you'll find out soon enough. And if I'm not, you'll regret not listening." Alexander studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, we'll go to the docks. But if this is a trap, you'll be the first one to pay for it." Leo swallowed hard but didn't argue. He knew the stakes. He also knew he had no choice but to see this through. The docks were eerily quiet that night, the only sounds the lapping of water against the piers and the distant hum of the city. Alexander and Leo moved cautiously through the shadows, their footsteps silent on the cracked pavement. Alexander's security team was nearby, but he had insisted on going in first. He needed to see this for himself. As they approached a dilapidated warehouse, Leo pointed to a faint light spilling from a cracked window. "That's it," he whispered. "They're in there." Alexander motioned for him to stay back, but Leo shook his head. "I'm coming with you," he said firmly. "I've got nothing to lose." Alexander hesitated, then nodded. Together, they crept toward the warehouse, their hearts pounding in unison. Inside, the scene was surreal. A group of men in dark suits stood around a table, their faces obscured by shadows. At the head of the table sat a figure cloaked in darkness, his voice low and commanding. "The broker." Alexander's blood ran cold as he listened to the conversation. The broker was orchestrating a massive corporate takeover, one that would cripple Alexander's empire and leave countless lives in ruin. And it was all set to happen tonight. Leo's eyes widened as he realized the scale of what they were up against. This wasn't just about Alexander. This was about power, greed, and the lives of thousands of people who had no idea what was coming. Alexander's mind raced. He had to stop this. But how? The broker's network was vast, his resources seemingly limitless. And then it hit him. The only way to take down the broker was to expose him, to bring his operation into the light. He turned to Leo, his voice low but urgent. "I need you to do something for me. Can you get to the police? Tell them everything. Bring them here." Leo hesitated, then nodded. "I'll do it." As Leo slipped away into the night, Alexander stepped into the light, his presence immediately drawing the attention of everyone in the room. The broker's men tensed, their hands moving toward their weapons, but Alexander raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I know what you're planning," he said, his voice steady, "and it ends tonight." The broker chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You're too late, Kane. The wheels are already in motion." "Maybe," Alexander replied, "but I'm not going down without a fight." What followed was a tense standoff, each side waiting for the other to make a move. But before the situation could escalate, the sound of sirens filled the air. Leo had done his part. The warehouse was soon swarming with police, the broker's operation unraveling before his eyes. In the chaos, the broker himself managed to slip away, but not before Alexander caught a glimpse of his face he would never forget. In the days that followed, the city was abuzz with the news of the broker's downfall. Alexander's empire was safe, but the experience had left him changed. He had seen the dark underbelly of the world he thought he controlled, and it had shaken him to his core. As for Leo, he found himself standing outside Alexander's mansion once again, this time by invitation. Alexander had kept his promise to help the boy, offering him a chance at a new life, a home, an education, a future. "You saved my life," Alexander said, as they stood in the study, the same room where their unlikely partnership had begun. "I won't forget that." Leo shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "I just did what I thought was right." Alexander nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, that's all it takes." The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they'd been through hanging between them. They had started as strangers, brought together by chance and circumstance. But now, they were something more. Allies. Friends. As Leo looked out the window at the city below, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. The streets had been his home for so long, but now, for the first time, he dared to dream of something better. And Alexander, watching him, felt a similar shift. He had spent his life building walls, protecting himself from the world. But now, he realized, those walls had also kept him from truly living. The story of the homeless boy and the billionaire had come to an end, but their journey was just beginning. Together, they had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. And in doing so, they had found something rare and precious, a second chance. As the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow over the skyline, Leo and Alexander stood side by side, two unlikely heroes who had changed each other's lives forever. And in that moment, they knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together.